Have you ever wondered how a single child born right in the middle of the crackling, radioactive geopolitics of 1965 manages to take a quiet and honestly, often difficult rural upbringing and synthesize it into a modern, global mythology? Well, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we aren't just rattling off facts. We're actually going to step into a living, breathing historical moment to witness exactly how an empire of imagination gets constructed from the ground up. Now, to really answer this question, we have to treat history as a living world. We need to drop ourselves directly into the immense global tension of the mid-1960s, a time when, frankly, the future of humanity felt entirely up in the air, before we zoom all the way in to a deeply personal, quiet genesis in rural England. So let's kick things off with Section 1, A World on the Brink, looking at the global context of July 1965. Picture the summer of 1965. The world is just vibrating with this crazy mix of unprecedented achievement and outright apocalyptic dread. On one hand, the Soviet Union announces orbital nuclear missiles, and the U.S. is escalating things in Vietnam, literally destroying its first surface-to-air missile site. But then, simultaneously, humanity is looking up at the stars. Mariner 4 is beaming back the very first close-up photos of Mars, and the British invasion is completely dominating global radio waves with the Beatles and the Stones. It is in this exact crucible of a month, where destruction and discovery are basically in a dead heat, that a baby girl named Joanne Rowling enters the world.
Which brings us to Section 2, King's Cross, the catalyst and the convergence of two strangers.
You know, empires often begin with quiet, almost invisible accidents. Back in 1964, two 18-year-old, non-college educated teenagers just happened to meet on a train departing London's King's Cross station. You've got Peter, the son of a machine tool setter, and Anne, a wren, whose own grandfather, Louis Vaillant, actually won the Croix de Guerre in World War I. Those simple introductions led to stolen kisses on a train bound for Scotland. And that precise geography, King's Cross, would eventually be burned into their daughter's mythology as the literal gateway to another world. The two lovers got married in early 1965, completely unaware of the absolute titan they were about to bring into existence.
Let's move right into Section 3, the disputed Genesis, on the 31st of July, 1965. Now, this is fascinating because the psychology of myth-making and class anxiety actually began almost immediately. Joanne was physically born at Yate General Hospital in a very working-class town, while her father worked the production line. Yet, for years, her origin story was subtly tweaked to claim she was born at the Cottage Hospital in the neighboring, distinctly more affluent suburb of Chipping-Sodbury. It seems like an innocuous shift, right? But it reveals an early environment that was highly conscious of status and bloodlines. And if you know her work, you know those are themes that would eventually anchor her entire fictional universe. That takes us to Section 4, the architecture of childhood, exploring the environments that forge fiction. If we track her geographic reality, we see this really clear trajectory moving further and further away from the modern world. They go from Yate to Winterbourne in 1971, where those early front garden adventures were born, to a final retreat in 1974 into the rural isolation of Tuchel, right near the Welsh border. And honestly, Tuchel was a masterclass in sensory atmosphere. Church Cottage was this Gothic residence, complete with old flagstone floors, a covered well, and it was situated literally just a stone's throw from a local graveyard. She and her sister would roam the River Wye completely unsupervised. It felt less like a standard house and more like a living, slightly eerie incubator. Cultivated by a deeply book-loving mother, it was exactly in this environment that a young Joanne penned her very first stories, including Rabbit at age 6 and The 7 Cursed Diamonds at age 11. But behind those seemingly idyllic country romps, a young girl was navigating a really intense microcosm. As her mother tragically battled multiple sclerosis and the emotional distance from her father grew, her home life started to fracture. For this self-described short, squat girl with thick glasses, reading wasn't just a fun pastime, it was an active escape hatch. Books, along with her local brownies group, became a necessary psychological fortress against the overwhelming complexities of her reality. And that leads perfectly into Section 5, Reality Forges the Fiction, looking at the unintended consequences of ordinary encounters. This is where it gets incredibly cool. Watch how historical facts are meticulously transmuted into myth. Remember that mischievous neighbor boy from Winterbourne? Yeah, his last name was Potter. Her terrifying teacher at Tuchel, Mrs. Sylvia Morgan, who actually gave Joanne a half mark out of 10 on her very first day, became the literal blueprint for every unsympathetic, villainous master at Hogwarts. Talk about holding a creative grudge. Her primary school headmaster, Alfred Dunn, whose school was founded by the famed abolitionist William Wilberforce, transformed into the wise Albus Dumbledore. And Hermione? Well, she was basically just Joanne herself at age 11, initially named Puckle before getting an upgrade. For an unhappy teenager suffocating in rural isolation, her best friend, Sean Harris, who became the core inspiration for Ron Weasley, was an absolute lifeline. And Sean happened to own a turquoise Ford Anglia. As Joanne later noted, that car meant absolute freedom. It meant zooming off into the darkness, away from the heavy reality of her mother's illness and her father's silence. That very real turquoise car didn't just save a teenager's sanity in the 1980s. It would eventually fly into the branches of a magical whomping willow, becoming immortalized for millions of readers. Of course, an imagination that massive requires some serious structural integrity. The academic foundations of this empire were built on a foundation of quiet rebellion. Gifted Jessica Mitford's autobiography Hans and Rebels by a great aunt, Joanne read wildly outside her syllabus at Exeter University. Her high school teachers, Lucy Shepard and Dale Neuschwander, demanded both strict exactness and boundless imagination. Her deep knowledge of French and classics provided the incredibly precise linguistic roots for those famous global spells. And later, her time spent researching human rights abuses for Amnesty International in London injected deep, resonant themes of systemic prejudice and resistance into what the world mistakenly thought was just going to be a simple children's story. So, to wrap this all up, an empire of this magnitude is never just born out of thin air. It is forged from the absolute crucible of an era. Take a mother's tragic illness, a terrifying schoolteacher, a turquoise Ford Anglia, and a chance meeting at King's Cross Station, and unfold it all against the apocalyptic dread of the Cold War. It really leaves us with one haunting question to take away. How often do the ordinary accidents, the geography, and the quiet human psychology of a single childhood silently reshape the imaginations of centuries to come? This has been The Explainer. Thanks for joining us, and keep questioning the world around you.